All right, it's 2 o'clock, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you happen to be in the country right now. Welcome to FTA's webinar presentation on how to prepare and submit your Recipient Information Request, your RIR. We know that a lot of you probably received notice from FTA recently with the RIR and asking you to submit various documents. So this webinar is geared to assist you in how to know what the webinar or what the RIR is asking and how to best respond to that. So just to kick off with some brief introductions. I'm Matthew Bussey. I'm a senior associate at RLS and Associates, and I am joined here today by my colleague Rich Garrity, who is a senior associate and director of compliance at RLS and Associates. Want to say hi, Rich?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, as the case may be. We're looking forward to today's session.
All right, thanks, Rich. So before we get started, I do want to mention that this is just one of a series of webinars that FTA is putting on with regard to how to respond to the RIR. Today, obviously, January 6th, we're focusing on state DOTs, but we will have 3 more sessions next week. Next Tuesday on the 11th is going to be a webinar just on civil rights. The 12th will be non-civil rights. And then on the 13th, on Thursday, then we're going to have a webinar that basically is geared towards Tier 4 agencies. So agencies that have operating expenses below 100 million. So if you want to attend again, or you have colleagues that missed this webinar or haven't been to one of them yet, by all means, you can forward this and they can join next week. So Rich, do you want to kick it off?
I will, and thank you, Matt. So today's webinar, as Matt indicated, is going to be focused exclusively on those of you who are subject for a state management review in calendar year 2022. This webinar is designed to assist you meet your obligation and upload of documents due later this month. There will be other technical assistance webinars conducted in each region that will be more comprehensive in scope, that will address the entire oversight review process. So stay tuned and keep checking your inboxes for notices regarding those other additional webinars. If you'll look at the bottom of your screen, there is both a Q&A and a chat window. Most of us working on various web-based platforms have experience in clicking on the chat window to post questions. We will be monitoring the chat window and the Q&A window, as the case may be, for your questions. You can type your questions in at any time during the course of the webinar. If it's a quick answer, such as when is the due date for the RIR upload, we'll answer that in the chat window itself as the webinar progresses. If your question is more complex, we are going to hold those questions in the interest of time until the end of the session. We have allocated a sufficient amount of time to cover your questions in that manner. So Matt, if you could go to the poll questions before we get started, we'd like to get a little information on you folks.
Sure. So I just started the poll, Rich.
Thank you. So you'll see that there's several options there for you. Is this the first time that you have participated in a state management or a comprehensive oversight review? If you have some experience, is your experience in 1 to 2 previous reviews? If you're a real seasoned veteran, 3 or 4 reviews, and for you types like me who have been around the block a time or 2, 5 or more reviews. If you could click your answer, we'll review those quickly.
Looks like the results are in, Rich.
And it looks like almost half of you, this will be the first time for a state management or triennial review. So those results are very informative, and hopefully this webinar will be very helpful to you. So let's take a look at the RIR process itself. Again, this webinar is going to focus strictly on the RIR. The oversight process itself will be detailed in more depth in another workshop. And we would just want to encourage you to not hesitate to reach out to the contractor firm that's been assigned to your review. That should have been communicated to you in your letter from the region announcing that you were subject to a review in 2022. And don't hesitate to reach out to your contacts within the FTA regional office on any specific questions about the type and depth of the documentation you should upload in response to the RER request.
Yeah, just piggyback on that, Rich, definitely, go ahead and start that relationship now with your reviewer. They'll be happy to hear from you. They're going to definitely take your phone call, and they would rather you contact them and get a proper explanation about what they're asking for so that you don't do any unnecessary work or give them something that they don't need. They're going to be happy to work with you on all of that. So definitely reach out to your reviewer and to your regional office, as Rich said. For those of you who may have not received a letter from FTA informing you that you're being reviewed in 2022, it's probably unlikely that you're being reviewed because COVID, we lost a year, caused some complications. So if you haven't received a letter from FTA with the RAR and you think you're supposed to be getting reviewed in 2022, then I would reach out to your FTA program manager and just clarify to make sure everybody's on the same page. So definitely recommend that. You want to go over the process, Rich?
Yes, thank you, Matt. And so you'll see that this is a fairly standardized diagram of the entire oversight state management review process. We're in step 2 of the 9 basic steps, which is the information upload request. After this process, FTA regional office and your contractor will be conducting a lot of homework looking at the documentation that you have provided. You'll be receiving further communications from your contractor who will be conducting the review, scheduling the site visit, perhaps requesting additional information, such as additional files relative to procurement and maintenance actions. Then all the reviews, it should be pointed out, in calendar year 2022 will be virtual. That means you'll be on a Zoom or a Teams type platform, whatever is established by your contractor review firm, and the reviews will be conducted remotely. In a non-COVID period, normally your contracting team would visit you on site, come to the state DOT office or the transit system office and do the information gathering as necessary. We're, because of the public health emergency, forced to do this remotely. And that does introduce some complexities as well as some shortcomings of the process, but this will be the second year in which virtual reviews are being conducted. And I think we've got most of the kinks worked out of the process. The process in the final stages will resume normal processes where the contracting firm will issue the report in draft format. You, as the recipient, will have an opportunity to review and comment on that draft report. And then the final report is issued, the clock starts. And if there were any findings in your review, the clock on corrective actions for you to remedy any of those deficiencies will begin. And again, more detail regarding that process will be provided in the larger webinar talking about the review process. So if we can go into the actual RER itself, the document template that has been provided to any of the organizations subject for a 2022 review is broken down into sections. And the very first section of that RER is the recipient profile. And you'll notice that the entire document is in tabular format, one of which is the operations profile, a table dedicated strictly for state DOTs. The third section relates to subrecipient facilities. So if you have constructed any maintenance or administrative facilities, say for your section 5311 subrecipients, this is the area that will require your attention. Then we ask for some general overarching questions on the level of award activity for both your FTA funded and non-FTA funded projects, and then contact information for your organization. And if you're a state DOT and you delegate responsibility on a program basis, it would be useful to include your Section 5311 program manager, your Section 5310 program manager, etc., and not just maybe the division director, the public transportation manager, etc. The key element of this section is to try to provide the reviewer with a good sense of your organizational structure, what you do as a state DOT, and the like. So the more information that you can provide to the contractor, the better off the review will be. If I can go to the next slide, Matt, Table 1 is really designed for those agencies that operate services, but nevertheless, even if you're a state DOT and you're not one of the limited number of state DOTs that are operating agencies, most of these questions will be NA, but do fill out, the name of the organization and the like, and you can just put NA in terms of if you're not an operating agency, you don't operate fixed route motor bus services and the like, just put NA as a state DOT. Because again, it is the next table. If we can advance slides, again, you'll see the detail in the top half about getting parameters on the various modes of service that an operating agency would fill out. If your state DOT does not operate, this will all be NA. But in terms of any facilities that you may have constructed, you'll see that we really capture that in Table 2. So again, only operating agencies really have information to fill out in Table 2. So if we can go to the next slide, which is subrecipient facilities. So this really will be the table that state DOTs in earnest begin to fill out, and we'll need to identify the subrecipient, description of the facility, maintenance facility, administrative facility, park and ride lot, whatever the case may be. What was the source of FTA funding that assisted in the construction or acquisition of that facility, the year completed, and the physical street address of that facility. Now, in years past, it would be common practice for a member of the review team to go out and visit that facility. That is an action that is not conducive to a remote review, but nevertheless, if you will fill out the street address for that facility, that would be appropriate. Table 4 is designed, and those of you who have been through the review process before, you'll note that in the beginning section of the draft report and final reports that you will receive, there's going to be some description of projects that you've completed since the last review, projects that are ongoing, and projects that you plan to undertake in the next 3 to 5 years. This is the source of that information. Try to be as inclusive as possible and take credit for project accomplishments as your state has managed to get a hold of in this trying past several years, and note those projects that you're hoping to undertake in the next several years. So I've got another poll question. Many of our state DOTs are organized so that we have individual areas of expertise, such as civil rights, perhaps it's procurement. So I'm going to ask another poll question in terms of what specific area are you most interested in as a state DOT transit professional? And if you could answer that question based on the categories provided.
Yep, and we've just given it a second here, Rich. We've got a lot of results coming in.
Okay.
Okay, and here are the results.
Well, it looks like we have a lot of generalists. Obviously, all of the above is by far and away the most notable answer, with procurement and financial management trailing behind at 19 and 15% respectively. So that's an interesting poll result. That helps us out greatly in the focus that we provide here in the Word document. And at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Matt to talk about the organization of the Word document template itself. Matt?
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, and just to do another shameless plug, again, next week, then we are going to have those additional sessions, one of which is just for civil rights and one of which is for non-civil rights. So if you fall into one of those two categories and you want to attend, those are on Tuesday and Wednesday next week, respectively. So moving on to section B of the recipient information request. Basically, so there are 23 sections that get reviewed, and each of those sections has a section in the RAR. Every section is designed the same way. It starts out with the basic requirement for whatever that section happens to be. Then it has a document table. The document table, first of all, states the required documents that you're being asked to upload. It'll also state the applicability of those documents. So, if it's asking for subrecipient oversight procedures and you don't have subrecipients, then it may not be applicable. So the applicability column will clarify that for you. Next up is date submitted, which seems a little silly, but it's helpful for the reviewer. If we're looking through a folder of all the documents that you submitted and we don't see something that we think we should have gotten, and we go back to your RAR and we say, oh yeah, they said that they submitted it on January 21st, then at that point, then we can reach out to you and get that corrected. So that's helpful for that reason. Then the next column is the electronic file name. And finally, the last column is comments from the recipient. And we really want to stress, use this box as liberally as possible. Definitely use it to explain anything. If you're not submitting a document, for instance, then explain why. If it's a document maybe that, is getting updated and you're saying, okay, once the update is finished and we've got the new version for you, then we'll provide it to you. Or, also if something's not applicable, say, we don't have subrecipients, so it's not applicable to us. So use that column to explain anything that needs explanation to clue in your reviewer. Then for some of the 23 review areas, then there are a few open-ended questions at the end. For those of you who've been through this process before, you probably remember the previous iteration of the RAR is actually used to be called the Grantee Information Request, the GIR, GIR, and it had a lot of questions that you were instructed to answer for your reviewer, a lot of explanation that you were supposed to provide. FTA has since shifted to the current RIR, the recipient information request, which is more of a document upload request than asking for narrative descriptions or narrative responses to questions, but still has a couple things that FTA wants you to address in a narrative format, provide to your reviewer prior to the review. So when you're submitting documents in response to the RAR, we'd like you to follow this file naming convention. This is described in the beginning of your RAR, so don't worry, you already have this information, but this really makes it, you're going to be uploading a lot of documents, and so this really makes it easier, I guess, for the reviewer to understand what you're uploading and what requirement are you uploading it in response to. So it'll help give clarity there. One thing also to note is that obviously we are well past the days of snail mail and whatnot. Your reviewer almost certainly has a file sharing website like Dropbox or something similar to that, where you're going to be doing all of your uploads for the RAR response. Work with your reviewer, get those instructions on how to access that, and try and do that pretty early on. Test your credentials. If your RAR response is due on, January 21st, you don't want to wait until 11:59 on January 21st to figure out that your login doesn't work. So definitely work with your reviewer to get those file sharing protocols, get your credentials and login information, and test that out to make sure that it works. So there are 23, as we mentioned before, 23 different review areas. I'm not going to go through all of them. Hopefully you're at least somewhat familiar with them. And just one other thing to note is that the FY22 Contractors Manual, which goes through all the questions that you're going to be asked, that is up on FTA's website, and that will give you detail for each of these sections. So definitely check that out. But so there are 23 review areas. A couple of them are new, so I will point those out. They weren't applicable back when you had your last review, probably in 2018. So the first new section is TAM, Transit Asset Management. Then also Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, PTASP. And another one that just got added this year that may or may not apply to the recipients on this call is cybersecurity. So we'll be going through each of these and what the RAR requests for each of these areas. First subject matter area that the RAR asks for documentation for is legal. And so the first request that the RAR makes is a list of litigations, breaches, defaults, disputes, or instances where the federal government was named as a party to litigation. Legal also asks that you submit a list of any claims that were made under the False Claims Act or any instances that your agency had of fraud, waste, or abuse. A couple things to keep in mind for these document requests. First of all, we're only talking about transit. So, if you have litigation or something like that that's related to a non-transit issue, then you can ignore that. Your reviewer doesn't care. So we're only dealing with transit-related litigations, breaches, defaults, claims, etc. The other thing is that if you do have any of these that you're notifying your reviewer about, that's going to prompt them to look at some follow-up information. They're going to want to see that you notified FTA's chief counsel or the FTA regional counsel. And so if you have those notifications, those communications, go ahead and provide that to your reviewer because they're going to ask for that eventually anyway. And then the last thing to know is just keep in mind, you probably want to coordinate with your legal counsel, your legal department, since they probably have access to all this information. The next thing in legal, and this is actually, you may know this actually isn't requested in the RAR, but it is requested if you go to the legal section of the contractor's manual. There's a document list at the beginning of each section that says what's requested. These, first of all, if you're engaged in any lobbying, obviously you can't lobby for transit purposes with federal funds, but if you're using any non-federal funds for lobbying, then you're supposed to be submitting on a quarterly basis your OMB LLL form. So if you've done any lobbying with non-federal money and you've been submitting that form, then provide that to your reviewer. Similarly, if you have any subrecipients or contractors, anything like that, they've been doing lobbying, then submit that relevant information for them as well. So throughout this webinar, we've got a bunch of review tips, just things that we think will be helpful and will assist in preparing your response. The first RAR tip that we have is that for files used to satisfy multiple requested documents, try and indicate where that information could be found. So if there's if you have a 200-page procurement policy and the reviewer is looking for information about liquidated damages, if you can just say, hey, liquidated damages are on page 83, then that's going to help your reviewer out quite a bit. The other thing another tip is that if no document is uploaded or you're not providing a web link or anything like that, then indicate why. That'll make sure that your reviewer knows, hey, this wasn't left blank by oversight. You actually considered it, but it's not applicable, or for whatever reason, then you have nothing to upload. And here's just an example going back to the document table in the RER. This is an example, a good example from our fictional transit agency, XYZ Transit. They've noted in the electronic file name column that things are not applicable, and then because they haven't uploaded anything, and then they have noted in the comments from recipient column why they're not applicable. So again, the reviewer is going to look at that and be like, okay, as of the date that the agency submitted its RAR, then this was not applicable. Obviously, during the review, the reviewer will confirm that it's still not applicable, that nothing's happened between when you submit the RAR response and when the review takes place. But this will give them an idea that as of the RAR submission, then it was not applicable. So just a good example for you to use. So Rich, do you want to talk about, I think your favorite subject, financial management capacity?
Thank you, Matt. So looking at the documents requested in this category, and this section of the contractor's manual and the RER request is probably one of the heavier lifts from your perspective in complying with the requirements. So item one is your annual audits, comprehensive annual financial reports or single audit reports. For many of you, this will be an organization-wide, not specifically a public transit unit audit report. We understand that, your reviewer will understand that, and that is document A. So you want to be sure to upload that. And because we lost a year due to COVID in 2020, FTA has undertaken a process where they're trying to get back on the traditional 3-year schedule. And this is the year that is catch up. So in your case, those of you subject to a 2022 review, the review firm assigned to you will be looking at a 4-year period, not a 3-year period. So make sure that when you upload those past financial statements or audit reports, you are providing the most recent 4 years for which the audits have been completed. Item B is if there are any internal audit reports that may focus on any grant activity associated with the public transit unit. If there are any such reports, please upload those. That would be item B. We're also looking in item C, a list of funding if state provides additional resources, perhaps on a state-funded transit program and or as a supplement to the federal share that can be used by your subrecipients as local match. We want to know the sources of those funds and the amounts that you've provided over the last 4 years and for the next 3 years. Also, any statewide or unit division level financial management policies. And we do want to call your attention to 2 CFR Part 200, often referred to as the super circular, or more appropriately, the uniform guidance. There is a requirement in there that dictates that when you expend federal funds, that you do so in accordance with written cost allowability standards. We've given you the citation there in the guidance. We want to make sure that that is incorporated in your department's fiscal policies. And also we want to talk about your policies that relate to your ECHO drawdowns and the requirement that those funds are dispersed within 3 business days after receipt.
So it's probably worth noting, emphasizing, Rich, those are 2 policies that FTA insists be in writing: your allowability of cost policy and your timely distribution of funds policy. So a lot of you may work on a reimbursement basis as far as your ECHO draws are concerned, but you basically have to have a written policy that says if you ever draw down on an advanced basis that you're going to disperse those funds within 3 business days. So FTA insists that these 2 policies be in writing. So that's what you need to provide to your reviewer.
All right, the next document may be one that may not be familiar to you at the public transit unit, but it is required of all state. And your state will have this somewhere, and this may be a little difficult for you to track down, but there generally is an annual agreement, the Cash Management Improvement Act, or CMIA agreement, that basically enables you to draw down funds from the Treasury as a state organization. And so you'll need to track down that document. That may not be something readily available to the public transit unit, but someone within the state DOT is familiar with this document, and it should be readily available for upload. Organization charts. The better your reviewer can understand how your state DOT is organized. Finance department could be within the public transit unit. It could be an external unit within the department. Please provide as detailed an organizational chart as possible. And then specifically for the individuals who have grant administration or grants management responsibility that handle the processing of subrecipient invoicing and the like, we want to get job descriptions for those individuals. FTA wants to ensure that people with the requisite technical and capacity to perform those functions hold those positions within your organization. And then resumes for the key or senior level people would be appropriate too. Next slide, please. In order to have your reviewer better understand your financial management systems, and those of you who are fans of the uniform guidance know that the uniform guidance focuses on requirements for the financial management system per se. And so sample records that give us an indication of the type and level of detail that you maintain on a transactional basis, in particular, identification of the subrecipient, the grant identification number, the name of the subrecipient, and all the data elements that are stipulated in the appropriate section of 2 CFR 200, most notably section 302B. We want to see that your financial management system adheres to those requirements. It is a requirement that you, as a recipient of federal funds, be able to produce variance reports, or those financial reports that look at actual expenditures year to date and contrast that with the budgeted amounts within the financial management system. That is, again, as Matt emphasized in a previous slide, a written requirement of the financial management system. In item L, if you're an operating agency and you use FTA funds for operating assistance, and this is primarily applicable to Section 5307 direct recipients, FTA wants to be sure that you're accurately calculating operating expenses. If this worksheet is found not in 9040 or 9070 circulars, but if you look in the 5307 circular, I believe it's in Appendix C2 of that circular, and you'll see the calculation. And it's just primarily this item is motivated by the fact that public health emergency grant funds that have been made available under CARES Act and the like does allow certain organizations that heretofore have not been eligible for operating assistance. There's a concern that those newbies to operating assistance do the calculations correctly, and the review teams have been instructed to look at this very carefully in the state management review and triennial review process. Item N is a multi-year, generally at least a minimum of 3 years, longer range if applicable. If your financial plans embrace a longer horizon than 3 years, that's fine, well and good. We want to see what your projection of revenues are for the next 3 years to support transit activity. And then capital and operating budgets for the past 3 years compared with actual results. Once again, that is typically a report for an operating agency that might be NA if your organization is not an operating agency. And our last slide on financial management, we want to be concerned is whether or not any funding source is at risk. Is the state match that's provided, that provides maybe 10% of capital assistance to some of your subrecipients, is it subject to annual appropriation by your legislature? Is it a dedicated fund that perhaps is subject to some sunsetting provision? FTA wants to know if any source of funding that's provided at the state level is subject to going away over the next several years. You would want to indicate that in response to item O in the RER. And then and I want to call your attention to item R. If you have subrecipients that charge indirect costs to the grant award, we want to identify those subrecipients. That will dictate a little extra review on the part of the contractors to ensure that indirect costs are being charged appropriately to federal awards. Then finally, we have some additional tips. I know the RER is a heavy lift for most of you, but use it as a preparation tool. It will position your organization well when it comes time for the actual remote review. It's an open book exam. If you follow the RER, if you follow the contractor's manual, we not only tell you what the questions are, but we also tell you specifically what the reviewer is looking for and why. You know, if I had this option to me as a college student, I'd probably be a Rhodes Scholar today. You have that opportunity in the state management review. It is an open book test. Take advantage of the contractor's manual guidance. Study it before the review begins. Your organization will perform much better the better understanding you have of being in the contractor's shoes. Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I mean, if it were me, I would distribute the various sections to the various applicable people in your organization. You know, if somebody, whoever's dealing with Title VI, give them the Title VI chapter. Whoever's, you know, doing procurement, give them the procurement chapter. Have them familiarize themselves so that nothing's a surprise when you get to the actual review. So the next section that we're going to be going through is technical capacity, which is, it's actually divided into 3 sections. There's technical capacity award management, there's program management, and there's project management. So the first section, award management, is just like it sounds, how you manage your awards, how you manage your grants. And so the RAR requests, first of all, your award management and reporting procedures. And, you know, examples of these are policies and procedures on completing your FFRs and MPRs, your federal financial reports, and your milestone progress reports. So if you have procedures about, you know, who's doing that, how you do them timely, and how you do them accurately, then provide those to your reviewer. Similarly, policies and procedures relating to your echo draws and how you go about that, who makes the request, who approves, who does the draw, making sure that the approval happens before the draw, all that. If you have that written down, provide that to your reviewer, give them context about how you operate. And then another example is policies and procedures relating to your single audits. So if you expend more than $750,000 in a year, you have to do a single audit. How do you make sure that that's done and done timely? And if there are any findings, that there are corrective actions, any written procedures you have with regard to that, provide to your reviewer. Then item B here is a closeout schedule for all of your open awards. One thing your reviewer is going to do, they're going to go into TRAMS, they're going to look at your awards, and they're going to be looking to see, are any of these really old, or are there any that are almost expended and probably should be closed? And so provide a closeout schedule to your reviewer showing when you plan on closing out those various awards. And it's also an opportunity to provide an explanation if there's anything wonky that you think needs explanation. Rich, do you want to talk about program management and subrecipient oversight, since this is geared towards state DOTs?
Yes, thank you. And this is a key category, particularly for state DOTs, because obviously you all have a vast majority of subrecipients. So our first topic, though, involves program projects preparation. They'll relate to development of the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. We want to know what the public involvement process, how you engage public participation before whatever approval board that you use adopts the STIP. And that's what you use for guidance in your funding activities for the year. Also, as a state DOT, we want to know a little bit about the process that you use to conduct outreach to the respective metropolitan planning organizations and how you incorporate their input into development of the STIP. Most of you will have a guidance document in this regard that addresses both A and B. Your RUR upload may be the same document, and as Matt indicated earlier, Chapter 2 might be the public involvement section for the general public, whereas Chapter 4 might be the interaction and cooperation with the respective MPOs within the state. Please point out the page number if you will. If you've conducted outreach meetings, public hearings, you've traveled in the dog and pony show throughout the state for your STIP public hearings, it would be helpful if you uploaded summary documentation of when and where those meetings were held, and any supplemental information that would give the reviewer an opportunity to understand the level of public input that was provided to item C. State management plans. If you have individual management plans for each of the programs that you administer, or whether you have one state management plan that covers 5310, 5311, and 5339, that's your option. Please upload that document. If your document is out of date and one of the things that you were hoping to do before the review is update your SMP, but you're not yet finished at the time of the RUR submission, you have a couple options. Upload the current SMP that's been approved by the regional office and add in that comments column that Matt pointed out in the beginning of this webinar. In the comment field, note that you're in the process of update, and that you'll provide in a supplemental email a approved copy of the SMP before the review. We want to see your standard subrecipient application package by program. We want to see your lists of subrecipients by program, and I want to underscore by program, so your 5311s, your 5310s, your 5339s. Please list those and identify program source. Oversight schedule. FTA is not prescriptive in the level or type of oversight that's conducted, but they do expect the state to conduct oversight, or any entity that has subrecipients conduct requisite oversight of those subrecipients. If you have a mini triennial review type process where you send out a state DOT staffer, or you use hired consultants to conduct those reviews, if you have a schedule of who has been reviewed during the past 3 years and the level of activity you anticipate in the forthcoming 3-year period, that would be extremely useful. That's the type of information you should upload in response to item G. I've always thought that G and H were a little bit backwards. What are your oversight procedures? That probably is a preliminary or prerequisite question. If you've got some type of overarching document that talks about the state's process for ensuring compliance of its subrecipients, types of reports that you collect that help you assure your state DOT that your various subrecipients are in compliance with applicable federal and FTA requirements. That's the type of documentation we're looking in item H.
And one thing before we move on from this topic, Rich, when you provide that list of subrecipients to your reviewer, provide a list of all the subrecipients you had during the entire review period. So even if somebody was, if you had a subrecipient in 2019, but they're no longer a subrecipient, you still want to include them on that list because your reviewer is going to be looking at your oversight of anybody who was a subrecipient at any time during the review period. So moving on to technical capacity project management. The first request is a list of FTA-funded capital projects undertaken during the review period. You're going to want to include the type of project that it was and also the project cost. Item B, project management plans, if written. You can see here it's not required for all projects. Project management plans, formal project management plans are required for any capital project over 100 million. For anything less than 100 million, you just have to have technical oversight mechanisms. So regardless of which applies, if you've got project management plans, provide those to your reviewer. If you've just got other types of mechanisms for providing technical oversight, then either explain or provide those to your reviewer. Item C, for quality control procedures, if written, if you have anything that says, how you stay on budget, how you stay on schedule, how you ensure that you don't incur costs prior to getting requisite permits, those types of things, any documentation along those lines, provide to your reviewer. For item D, then identify FTA-funded capital projects with significant delays or cost increases. Keep in mind that this applies not just to construction, but also to other capital projects as well. And then item E is same thing, but for any subrecipients. So if you have any subrecipients that had projects with significant delays or cost increases, then provide that list to your reviewer as well. Next up, procedures for administering and monitoring construction projects, bus procurements, and other capital projects if written. Item G, a list of FTA-funded projects for which you used force count labor or any of your subrecipients used force count labor. Force count labor is just when you use your own staff for work on the project. And there are various requirements that can possibly get triggered. If you have a force count labor plan that you're using force count labor for $1 million or more, you have to submit a plan to FTA. If it's $10 million or more, then you actually have to get it approved by FTA before you start the project. So keep those in mind. And then for items H and I here, provide a list of all your transit service contractors and lessees, and also the contracts or lease agreements that you have with the respective service contractors or lessees. And item J, similarly, anything that you have to demonstrate the oversight that you're conducting of those transit contractors or lessees. So here are a couple more RIR tips. If you upload a document, please indicate where in the document the relevant piece of information can be found. I think we've touched on that one already, but bears repeating. If possible, upload searchable documents. If you don't have a written policy or procedure to attach, then explain what the policy or procedure is in practice. So if you, for instance, you don't have anything written about how you develop MPRs and FFRs, if you can take the time to provide a brief paragraph to your reviewer to give them context about that, then they'll appreciate that. Also, if a document is not applicable, obviously explain why. Rich, do you want to do TAM?
All right, thank you, Matt. For most of you in the state DOT category, you likely have a series of tier 2 type entities subject to the TAM requirement. You're a TAM plan sponsor, and most of your subrecipients hopefully participated in a group TAM plan. You'll want to make sure that those plans are uploaded as part of the rule request. If you did have agencies that opted out of the group plan, You'll want to make sure that you upload the individual plan for those organizations as well. Your annual NTD report relative to achieving the target metrics that are outlined in your TAM report and in your annual NTD submission. You'll want to submit that in particular on rolling stock and any facilities that you have acquired on behalf of your subrecipients and their own acquisitions. Updates on the performance calculations, useful life benchmarks, and the like, all again should be available in your TAM planning process. And if you have an accountable executive at the local organization, that should be named in the plan for each of your subrecipients. That should be noted in the TAM plan. You should upload the documentation for your subrecipients in that regard. If I can have the next slide, please. We want to see evidence in the event that we had group plans, that group plan, there was correspondence, email, that both the plan participant as well as the state DOT, if it was not part of a group plan, evidence that the plan was shared with the state, those that went out on their own. We want to make sure that that was taken care of. And if the recipient is in the service area or the planning jurisdiction of an MPO, this may not relate to a lot of non-urbanized areas, but ensuring that the MPO was also provided information on the TAM results. Supporting documentation that may be relevant that was done may not be necessarily included in the TAM report itself, but supported the development of the performance targets, the investment strategies, and the like. Any supplemental documentation that you may have that would be useful to the reviewer would be helpful. Documentation of coordination with the group plan participants. We know in some of the group plans, the level of participation by the group plan participants varied from subrecipient to subrecipient. It is a requirement. They all were actively engaged in the group plan. So we want to see some evidence of coordination that took place in the preparation of those group plans. If I can go to the next slide, please. I'm not going over every single request document. So in particular, item I, if you did have a subrecipient that opted out, I mentioned previously, we want to have not only a copy of their plan, but some formal notification of the state DOT that they're opting out of the group plan, that they were going to go ahead and go it alone and prepare their own plan. We're going to want to see correspondence to that regard. So that should be uploaded as part of the documentation required for item I. Item J, again, documentation that once developed, that you as the group plan sponsor made the plan available to all participants in a readily accessible format. Item K, evidence that your subrecipients are actually following the TAM plan that was prepared for their organization. And again, some duplication there with job descriptions for the accountable executive, which is required under the TAM planning process. Then finally, item N, any oversight tools that you may use as the primary recipient with your subrecipients. And we're assuming that for state dots, they'll primarily be tier 2 subrecipients that opted out of the group plan. There's still some oversight obligation. Any tools that you may use to ensure that those tier 2 subrecipients who develop their own TAM plan, you have some responsibility to ensure that they actually execute that plan. So I'm going to continue on with section 7 of the contractor's manual, which is satisfactory continuing control. And you'll see that this section is organized somewhat first with respect to real property, facilities, land, and the like. And then after the first several questions, it will specifically address rolling stock and other type of equipment. So the first series of questions and the requested documents will relate to real property acquisition. If you have any real property management procedures and how you maintain real property, if you're a state DOT, this might include park and ride lots that were funded with FTA assistance. For most of you, you will not directly be the owning agency of the property. Title will rest with the subrecipients. This requirement may not apply. Item B, however, is a listing of any real property acquired or purchased or constructed during the life of the property acquired with FTA funding. So you want to have an inventory of real property owned by subrecipients. In particular, we want to make sure that every real property acquisition that has occurred after December 26, 2014, which is the effective implementation date of the uniform guidance, it requires annual real property reports. So we're going to want to make sure that your reviewer knows property that have been acquired, improved, or purchased since that time. Now, I don't see this happen in day-to-day activity in rural environments and environments that most state DOTs have oversight in, where we have excess real property, but it could happen if the property is no longer required for transit purposes. It is required that that entity prepare an excess real property plan as to what they intend to do with that excess property. That plan should be uploaded, if applicable, for item C. Any incidental use agreements, incidental use has to be approved by the state DOT. There should be agreements in effect that, all right, we built a building just last year and it has a 20-year growth horizon. We may have some extra space in that facility for incidental uses, but there should be some prior approval of those incidental uses, and any correspondence that would document the approval of that incidental use should be part of the upload process. Item E, a list of any facility projects that are in the pipeline that have not yet been undertaken would be the list of documents that you should upload for item E. There is particular attention, in particular following Superstorm Sandy, ensuring that when we do acquire and or build or improve real property that may be located in a special flood hazard area, that one, we identify that, we know what hazard level the facility is located in, and that we have sufficient insurance coverage to cover the federal interest in that building that may be triggered by the fact that that facility is located in a special FEMA flood hazard area. Procedures. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
If I might interject. So this is a key item for FTA right now, and they're definitely paying a lot of attention to it. It's actually one of those narrative questions that I said are occasionally interspersed within the RER. And the key thing to take away is that not only do you have to have flood insurance if you have any facilities or property that are in flood hazard zones, you have to have a process for determining whether flood insurance is necessary. So FTA is both looking at the result. Do you have the flood insurance, and do you have a procedure for determining if you need flood insurance, and then so that you can procure it? So that's just something to keep in mind.
And then finally, evidence of that insurance so that the reviewer can determine whether or not the federal interest in that real property has been protected through your insurance coverage levels. Equipment management procedures, item I. Now we're shifting from real property to primarily rolling stock in this question. We're looking at equipment management procedures. What are the minimum maintenance requirements and care, prevention of loss, insurance, disposition procedures, and the like? What are the standard requirements that you impose on your subrecipients to ensure that that equipment is maintained in a state of good repair and is protected from loss or theft or other damage. And of course, as you know, in the uniform guidance, there is a requirement for recipients of FTA funded equipment that you periodically conduct, no less frequently than once every 2 years, a physical inspection or inventory of that equipment and reconcile that with your written property records, some documentation demonstrating that your inventory is up to date, has been reconciled with the physical inspection, etc., is the type of documentation you need to upload for item J. Item K, the list of vehicles. Tabular presentation probably is the preferred format, as long as you give us the required fields with some indication as to whether or not the status of the vehicle, whether it's in the active category, contingency fleet, or awaiting disposition. Whether or not the equipment is FTA funded, there's federal interest in it, or whether or not it's 100% locally funded or non-federally funded, whether the equipment's directly operated or leased to a third-party contractor, and the like. We can go to the next category. Equipment dispositions the last 3 years. Most of you generally control that process pretty tightly. There should be readily available documentation on dispositions that have been approved over the last, and let me update that, to the last 4 years, since we're going to be on a 4-year cycle in this round of reviews. And again, tabular presentation, identifying the vehicles with the required ID fields is preferred by your contractor. Item M primarily relates to your subrecipients that provide fixed route service. What is the elements that may apply to spare ratios and the like? Do they document peak period requirements so that you can assess most of your subrecipients likely will be in the fixed route mode, will be under 50 peak period vehicles, and therefore FTA is not prescriptive on what that spare ratio should be, but there should be some review so that we do not have excessive spare capacity in our fixed route fleets among your subrecipients. So any guidance that you provide and any oversight to monitor spare vehicle ratios should be provided in elements M and N in the RER upload. Not often found in rural environments that the state DOTs will be responsible for, but in the event, rare event in my mind, a subrecipient has a contingency fleet, will want to document that requirement. Unlikely that any of your subrecipients operate rail services, so P would not be applicable for most state DOTs. You will not have subrecipients with rail operation. If vehicles are leased to service contractors and the state provides minimum requirements for what has to be in that third-party agreement with the private operator, or you have a standard template that you require your subrecipients to use, please upload that as part of item Q. And then again, we have some more tips. Try to be as accurate as possible when you answer questions about assets and facilities. Your contractors comparing that with FTA internal documentation. When discrepancy arise, it calls into question your asset management capabilities. So you want to be as accurate as possible and avoid those types of questions coming up during the remote review. And then similarly, especially those of you who have a large number of subrecipients, you just need to be on top of subrecipient activity, particularly when they are leasing equipment to lower tier entities, service contractors, and the like. And you want to make sure that all applicable federal requirements are being imposed on the private operator as applicable to ensure compliance with both FTA and uniform guidance project equipment management standards. So let's continue on with maintenance. What are the written equipment maintenance plans? Once again, the wide range of equipment that is operated by your subrecipients and by the state DOT, if you're an operating agency, may include everything from minivans to ferry vessels. And FTA generally is not prescriptive with respect to what has to be in the written maintenance plan, but you must have a written maintenance plan, preferably with goals and objectives. What is the purpose of the organization's maintenance program? What are the types of equipment that are the responsibilities of the organization to maintain? What is the system and frequency of periodic inspections and maintenance events that should be performed? And are those events being carried out? If you have subrecipients with facilities, do the subrecipients have facility maintenance plans? Just like rolling stock, we want to ensure that facilities are maintained to a state of good repair, and subrecipients should have facility maintenance plans as well. Moving on quickly into procurement. Many of you may have state purchasing requirements so that your subrecipients don't have to do a lot of heavy lifting on procurement. They can buy off of a state contract, in which case the state is responsible for complying with its own state procurement procedures, as well as other applicable FTA funded requirements. Those policies must be in writing. That's the document you should be uploading with respect to item A. Item B relates to the hiring of architectural and engineering services. You may be aware that there are special requirements associated with the Brooks Act, which dictate that we do not include price as a factor in our evaluation and selection of architectural and engineering services and the related disciplines. We use a qualifications-based only procedure. There are some permissive exceptions to Brooks Act procedures if you have a state statute that was adopted prior to August 10th of 2005. If you have such legislation that governs the hiring of architectural and engineering services, you should inform your contractor by uploading copies of the statute and procedures that the state uses to hire architects in that area. Procurement standards of conduct. As you know, both uniform guidance and 4220 do require that every entity receiving federal funds must adopt standards of conduct that not only cover employees of the organization, but affiliated organizations and partners, spouses, immediate family members. It must address the acceptance of gifts, what is acceptable, what is not. And then finally, the standards of conduct must address disciplinary actions when violations of those standards have been identified. What will we do? That is a comprehensive standard of conduct document. That's part of the requirements that we want to see. Also, you may recall in the uniform guidance, there is an emphasis now that the recipient or subrecipient of federal funds is solely responsible for the resolution of any procurement protests and disputes that may arise in the course of an organization's procurement activities, as well as the resolution of any contract disputes that may arise between the buyer and the seller in the execution of those procurement contracts. And so procurement protest procedures, if you have a template that you require your subrecipients to use, or how do you monitor the fact that your subrecipients have procurement protest procedures in place, would be an applicable item to upload for item D. Item E is a list of FTA funded procurements awarded since the last review. So for the 22 entities under review, that will be a 4-year period. Tabular format is preferred, and basically refer to the RER item E, the table format in that document. The reason that we're asking for additional information in this regard is that your contracting firm, when they give you the final agenda, approximately 10 business days before the site review, the contractor will identify a handful of selected procurements that they would like to review. And in a remote setting, that is going to entail the upload, a secondary upload of documents related to procurement activities to the contractor's identified procurements that will be subject to review. Under normal circumstances, we would review those documents on site. It's too much to ask you to upload procurement documents for everything you've done in the last 4 years. So we will be selective. There will be a secondary upload request that you will be informed, and you'll be given, again, at least 10 days in advance to upload that document, and that will form the basis of the contractor's review of those documents. If you have a procurement contract or third-party contract where a change order exceeds $250,000 in value, we want a list of what those change orders were. We want to make sure that those change orders were consistent with FTA guidance relative to change orders. If there have been any protest in the last 4 years that have been received either directly by the state DOT or by any of your subrecipients, list those as item G. Capital leases since the last review is self-explanatory, and a list of any claims filed against you as the state or the subrecipient since the last review is the documentation required for item E. So with that, Matt, can you take it for DBE?
Sure, let's start the civil rights sections. So first up, we've got Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, DBE. And the first thing the RIR is going to request is your most recent DBE program. If it's not uploaded to TRAMS, again, your reviewer will have access to TRAMS. One thing I would caution, I would say, the DB program isn't something that has to get turned in, submitted to FTA on a periodic basis like a lot of the other civil rights documents are. And so if it's been a while since you've dusted that off, take a look, make sure that's up to date, make sure whoever's listed as the DBLO, the DBE liaison officer, make sure that's accurate, and provide that to your reviewer. For item B, provide a organizational chart, which includes the DBLO, again, the DBE liaison officer. The chart should indicate that the DBLO has directed independent access to the CEO, basically meaning that they don't have to go through channels or anything like that if they need to talk to the CEO about DBE matters. For item C, the DBLO job description. So this is actually the job description for the person who holds the DBLO position. So hopefully in their job description, it lists some DBE requirements, some of the things that they're supposed to be doing as DBLO. That's what your reviewer is going to be looking for. Next up, for item D, documentation of implementation of small business element measures. 2012, the DB regs were updated to require that your DB program has small business elements. And so your reviewer is going to, first of all, check your DB program to make sure that's in there. And second of all, they're going to look for documentation that you've actually implemented the small business element as you said you would in your DB program. So upload all that to your reviewer. For item E, shortfall analysis and corrective action plan, if not required to be submitted to FTA. So obviously you have a 3-year goal for what your DB participation is. If there are any fiscal years that happened during this review period where you didn't meet your DBE goal, then you have to perform a shortfall analysis and basically explain why and say what you're going to do so that you meet it again in the future. If you are a top 50 agency as far as the level of funding you receive from FTA, then that's actually something that you have to submit to your RCRO by December 29th of the year of the calendar year following the fiscal year that you didn't meet your goal. I don't know if that applies to anybody on this call, but if that's the case, obviously make sure that you submitted that to your RCRO. Otherwise, make sure that you have those shortfall analyses for any years that you didn't meet your goal, and you'll just retain those, provide them to your reviewer, and they'll take a look and make sure they're sufficient. Finally, for item F, a list of any DBEs terminated or substituted on a project. So if you have any projects and a prime contractor tried to terminate or substitute a DBE, there are certain requirements for that. They've got to have good cause. They've got to get your prior written approval. There are a bunch of time requirements. And so provide a list of any of those instances to your reviewers so they can follow up on that. For Title VI, then the first thing that's requested is your most recent Title VI program, if not uploaded to TRAMS. Obviously, your Title VI program has to be submitted every 3 years, so there's a possibility that you may be revising it or something like that. If that's the case, then I would just use that comment box and say, hey, we're working on the new version. We'll get to you prior to the review, and do that as opposed to submitting your old version that's about to be superseded. Obviously, the reviewers, they want to look at what's current. Also provide a listing of all Title VI investigations, complaints, and lawsuits that have occurred since your last Title VI program submission. Obviously, listing the Title VI investigations, complaints, and lawsuits, that is a component of your Title VI plan. So your Title VI plan would include those. Your reviewer is looking for any of them that have happened since your last submission. For item C, provide a list of any language assistance training that you've given to staff, to comply with your language assistance plan component of your Title VI plan. Then for item D, provide any examples of public participation activities you've performed since the last comprehensive review that align with your Title VI program. Obviously, one thing to note here is whatever's in your Title VI program is what you're going to be held to. So in your public participation plan and your Title VI plan, if you say you're going to do X, Y, and Z, your reviewer is going to be looking to see, hey, in the situations where it was applicable, did they do X, Y, and Z? And so anything you can provide to your reviewer to show that you've been abiding by your Title VI plan's public participation plan, that'll go a long way and help out. So provide that to your reviewer. For item E, provide a list of transit facilities cited or constructed since your last review, and also copies of the corresponding equity analyses. Obviously, there are thresholds within Title VI. If you're not above the Title VI threshold of 50 peak vehicles and in a 200,000 UZA, you don't have to do equity analyses for major service changes and fare changes, but you do have to do them if you have cited or constructed a transit facility. So just keep that in mind. Also, F is kind of forward-looking. If you've got any transit facilities that you're planning to construct in the next few years, and you've already gotten to the point where you did the equity analysis, then provide that to your reviewer. If you haven't, if you're just in the offing and you haven't gotten to that point yet, just explain, hey, we're working on this. We know it's a requirement. We're going to do it when it becomes applicable. For item G, provide a list of any fare changes or major service changes since the last Title VI program submission. And if you are above that peak vehicle threshold and UZA threshold, again, 50 and 200,000 respectively, then provide the equity analyses for those fare changes or major service changes. If you engaged in any new fixed guideway service or new starts or small starts projects, then provide equity analyses for those. For states and state DOTs, then you want to provide your competitive selection or annual program of projects process. And one thing you also want to provide here in item K is a list of all the subrecipient applications that you received during the review period. Your reviewer will look to make sure that the required elements are in there. And obviously, there's a lot that goes into that for first-time Title VI applicants and whatnot. So provide all of that to your reviewer. We have a couple more RIR tips. First of all, we'll beat a dead horse here and reiterate this one. Use the comments from recipients column of each RIR sections table as often as possible. I'd much rather have too much information than too little. If you have questions about what you need to provide, contact your reviewer and ask. Use links to your website or other websites and documents when appropriate. If you've got a reasonable modification policy on your website, then you don't have to print it out, scan it, and upload it in the ADA section. You can just provide a link to your reasonable modification policy. So with that segue, we will move on to Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. This is broken up into two sections in the review guide. We've got, first of all, Americans with Disabilities Act general requirements, and then we have a second section that is related to complementary paratransit. So we'll start with the general section. The first thing that the RAR asks for is that you upload your ADA complaint procedures. Again, if these are on your website, then you feel free to use a website citation. One thing I'll caution you on is that sometimes we go on websites and we'll see the ADA complaint procedures and it'll be under like the complementary paratransit tab. And it's good that they're on the website, but one thing to keep in mind is ADA complaints can arise from fixed route, from complementary paratransit, from just individuals being in your facilities. That can arise from all sorts of things. So really, you keep in mind that it's broader than just complaints relating to complementary paratransit. If you have a complaint form, upload that. Obviously, one of the requirements under ADA is that you sufficiently advertise to the public how that they can file a complaint if they feel aggrieved under the ADA. For item C, you're supposed to retain ADA complaints for a year and a summary of all your ADA complaints for 5 years. So provide your ADA complaint record retention procedures. For item D, provide driver handbooks, operating and training manuals, ADA related service bulletins, all that type of stuff so that your reviewer can go through and make sure that there's nothing contrary to the ADA in your training manuals and whatnot. For item E, you have to have some processes in place to be monitoring your staff to make sure that they're complying with provision of service requirements under ADA. So, that they're using the stop announcements like they're supposed to, or that they're yelling out stops, that they're using the lift appropriately, all those different types of things. And so whatever you have as far as documentation to show that you are in fact monitoring your employees with regards to provision of service requirements, provide that to your reviewer. So maybe you have checklists, or you do ride-alongs, or you follow buses in one of your vehicles to make sure that nobody's not picking up people in wheelchairs at bus stops, those types of things. Anything you've got, just provide to your reviewer. For item F, provide a website citation to your ADA reasonable modifications procedure. Obviously, this is something that's supposed to be on your website. So if it's not on your website, get it on your website and then provide a website citation to it. Provide any rider's guides, including paratransit guides, again, so that your reviewer can look through, make sure that everything is explained correctly and nothing is contrary to ADA. For H, provide a list of new facilities constructed or facilities altered since the last review. Obviously, your reviewer is going to want to make sure that those were accessible if you constructed new facilities or if you made alterations. And for item I, then provide a certification of equivalent service and supporting analysis if you procured any inaccessible vehicles for demand response, or if any of your subrecipients did. So if you procure inaccessible vehicles for demand response, you have to do two things. First, you have to actually go through an analysis to ensure that people with disabilities and people without disabilities are being treated equivalently. And then you also have to file with the FTA a certificate of equivalent service saying that you did that analysis. So if that is applicable to you or to your subrecipients, then provide that to your reviewer. Moving on to ADA for complementary paratransit, first things that are required are upload the paratransit rider's guide and the application form for eligibility. Provide your operations, dispatch, scheduling, and reservation procedures. Your reviewer is just going to want to make sure that you're scheduling trips within an hour on either side of the time that someone requested a trip. For item D, provide sample notification letters that you send to applicants for complementary paratransit eligibility. Anytime you give anything less than unconditional eligibility, then you're supposed to send them a letter with the specific reasons for that and also giving them the right to appeal. So for any letters that you have that denote conditional eligibility or temporary eligibility or an outright denial, provide those samples for your reviewer to take a look at. Then also provide your definitions for denials, missed trips, on-time performance, excessively long trips, basically any capacity constraints, and also provide to your reviewer the related data showing that you're monitoring your system for capacity constraints as well. If you have any ADA complementary paratransit service contracts, you outsource that or your subrecipients do, then provide those service contracts. And also note this isn't listed in the ADA general section of the RAR, but this is applicable to the general too. If there's any outsourced operations, then make sure to provide those contracts to your reviewers so they can take a look at them, and provide any oversight tools that you use to oversee and make sure that your contractor is abiding by the ADA. Also, any contracts with private entities to operate ADA complement repair transit service, so duplicative. Oversight tools for subrecipients, including required reports, questionnaires, and checklists for ADA complement repair transit service. So in other words, provide anything that can document your oversight of your subrecipients to make sure that if they're doing complement repair transit, they're abiding by all the requirements. And
before we get on to EEO,
sure,
obviously most of the state DOTs will not be operating entities. Right. And so these questions will not necessarily be applicable to the state DOT, but what the review will be looking for is how does the state ensure and conduct its oversight of subrecipients. And we should note that as part of the review, and this will be addressed in the more detailed webinar about how the review will be conducted, but the contractors will be talking to subrecipients as part of your state management review process, generally selecting 1 or 2 subrecipients from each program, time permitting, and they will conduct some remote interview, not necessarily evaluating the compliance obligations of that entity, but looking at how that entity reports, how the state is providing oversight of its operations. So do be aware of that element of the review. So to the extent that you can provide information about your oversight procedures, even though you do not directly operate the service, will be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. That's spot on. And one point that I'll just add on to that as well is, if we were coming to do your SMR and we were actually going there physically, then, you may live in a big state and you may have remote subrecipients that are pretty far away, and that may in the past have prevented the reviewers from going and visiting those subrecipients. Obviously, with the remote process, then geographical proximity to the is not as big of an issue. And so I would caution perhaps all of your subrecipients, even the ones that are far away and typically get neglected by FTA's reviewers, that to just be prepared that they could get picked. So just something to keep in mind. So moving on to equal employment opportunity, the first thing that you'll provide is you'll provide a head count, the number of recipient employees, transit-related employees working on an FTA-funded program. This includes both full-time and part-time, and this basically shapes the applicability of EEO, because if you meet certain thresholds, you have to do certain things. If you have 50 or more employees and you receive $1 million or more in operating or capital assistance, or if you receive $250,000 in planning assistance, then you have to have an abbreviated program. If you have 100 or more employees and you meet those financial thresholds, then you have to have a full DB program. And so that's going to apply to your subrecipients as well. And it also, we'll see that there's an oversight component. So if you're subrecipient, if they've contracted service and their contractor meets those requirements, then they would have oversight responsibilities over those contractors, et cetera. For item B, provide your most recent EEO program. If it's not already in TRAMS. Again, that would either be an abbreviated or a full program, depending on the applicability. For item C, provide sample documents used for internal and external dissemination of the EEO program. Internal dissemination, you might have the EEO statement or the program included in employee manuals or posters in the break room or whatnot. External dissemination, usually that's if you have job postings or something like that, making sure that you advertise that your DOT is an equal opportunity employer. For item D, an organizational chart identifying the EEO officer, self-explanatory. The EEO officer, the importance of the EEO program is really indicated by who the EEO officer is. So typically your reviewer is going to want to see somebody who's an executive and has direct access to the CEO to discuss EEO matters. Provide that person's job description, and also provide job descriptions for any other employees that are in a supporting role for the EEO officer. Provide your performance evaluation for managers and supervisors. Provide your employment practices chart. We've got a circular reference that we won't go over all the elements, but if you go to the circular reference, then you can see everything that's supposed to be in there. For item H, provide your EO complaint logs, and also include anything like lawsuits or anything like that as well. And feel free, the reviewer doesn't need to know specifics about like the employees' names or anything like that, so feel free to redact those for privacy. For item I, provide agendas, sign-in sheets, anything like that for meetings conducted where you're educating your subrecipients or staff on EEO. Similarly, any trainings that you've done with management, you'd want to provide agendas and sign-in sheets. Every time somebody is promoted to a supervisory role, they're supposed to have EEO training within 90 days. So if you have anything along those lines, they can demonstrate that and provide that. Item K, you provide a list of EEO training topics that you train on. Item L lists newly hired supervisors and managers who attended that training I just mentioned. For item M, provide a sample of recruitment entities and ads for job positions. Your reviewer will probably go to your website and look to see if there are any job postings, just to make sure that you're saying that you're an equal opportunity employer. But provide those if you can. For item N, a log of recruitment locations and recruitment dates for the review period. Item O, a list of internal and external dissemination of the EO program for each year since the last EO plan update. Obviously, the EO plan is going to discuss how you had previously disseminated it internally and externally. So this is asking for anything that you've done since the last EO plan was submitted. Also provide a list of meetings with affinity groups since last EO plan update, and list subrecipients or contractors that meet the threshold to develop an EO program. So like I mentioned, if you have any subrecipients that meet the threshold for needing a program, then you're supposed to be collecting their EO guides, reviewing it for sufficiency, making sure that they're complying with the EO as they're supposed to be. Similarly, if those subrecipients have lower tier subrecipients or contractors that meet the thresholds, then they have that responsibility. So everything kind of flows downhill. So a few more RAR tips. First of all, this is an important one for me. Make sure your documents are dated. If somehow I end up with 3 Title VI plans from your agency, I want to be able to tell which one is the most current one, so please date your documents. If a requested document is in the process of being revised, indicate that in the RAR comments. If after the RAR submission you have updated documents or new documents, submit them to your reviewer. And for this, I would say probably best to email your reviewer. Don't just add them to the FTP site. I know that our FTP site, if somebody adds a document 2 months later or whatever, then I'm not going to get a notification. I won't know that unless you tell me. So it's probably best just to reach out to your reviewer, see if they want you to email it to them, or if it's a huge document or something, maybe they'll ask you to update the FTP site. But just work with your reviewer on that. And then same thing, keep your reviewer informed about any changes or additions to what is submitted, just so they're apprised of that. Rich, do you want to talk school and charter?
Absolutely. So as you know, we have prohibitions against the exclusive operation of FTA funded assets in competition with private school bus operators. And so this element of the review is designed to ensure that any exclusive school bus operations are consistent with 49 CFR Part 604 and 605 for school bus and charter bus, respectively. Element 15 in the contractor's manual and the RER template requests a list of assets used school bus operation. They're there that FTA would want to know about. There are some exclusions.
Really quickly, Rich, I'm having you break up a little bit. I don't know if maybe some of the recipients can note in the chat if they're having difficulty hearing you.
Just okay. The temporary internet glitch.
Okay. Yeah. So it looks like that was the case. I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you now. So just maybe if you can recap what you just said for people who missed it.
Right. Yeah, we want to avoid competition with FTA-funded assets against private school bus operators. List of any FTA-funded assets that may be used with permission in exclusive school bus operations. That should be few and far between for most state DOTs. That may not be applicable. Any recipients who have or subrecipients who have contractors that also operate school bus service would be of interest to the reviewer, because we want to make sure that those entities are not inadvertently using FTA funded assets and mixing them with other business interests operated by that contractor. And so we want to make sure that they're playing by the rules. And then any complaints that have been filed by private operators alleging improper use of FTA funded equipment for school service, exclusive school bus service, would be of key there. With respect to the charter bus applications in section 16, there are, as you know, both exemptions and exceptions to the regulations. When an entity provides a charter service pursuant to one of the exceptions in 49 CFR Part 604, they must report certain documentation and data elements associated with that charter service trip that was otherwise permissible under the regulation. So we want to make sure that those service logs are submitted by the subrecipients, and those examples, those documents are what should be uploaded to meet the requirements of item A. A list of any real property that may be used to support the maintenance of equipment used for charter bus operations. List of any subrecipients that have contractors that you have leased equipment to that may also operate a charter service. So you have a county subrecipient, they may have entered into an agreement with ABC Transit Inc., a for-profit company, by those companies in item C. And like we had in the school bus operation, item D is any complaints that you've received as a state DOT alleging an illegal provision of illegal charter service that was contrary to the regulation. You should upload a listing of those complaints. Those should have been filed directly with the FTA, but in the event that you received any complaints, please notify your reviewer in item D.
Thank you, Rich.
Matt, Drug-Free Workplace Act and Drug and Alcohol.
Yep, we'll touch on these briefly. So Drug-Free Workplace Act, the first requirement is obviously that you submit your written drug-free workplace policy. This is distinct from your drug and alcohol testing policy, so just make sure that's the case. Provide your examples of drug-free awareness notifications if you have brochures or posters or email blasts that you do to your employees, advising them of your employee assistance program, your EAP, or any other materials or resources that you have that you disseminated. Provide anything you can as far as those are concerned. Then for item C here, the number of employees with a federal or state criminal drug statute conviction during the review period. Hopefully this answer is 0 for you, but if you do happen to have an employee who was convicted of a drug statute in the workplace, then it's not the end game or anything like that. Your reviewer is just going to want to make sure that you follow the reporting requirements and whatnot for FTA. So they'll just make sure that the requirements that are implicated and triggered in those situations were followed. Drug and alcohol program. You'll want to provide a copy of your board adopted drug and alcohol policy with the date of board adoption. If you don't have a board, just whatever your highest authority is, your CEO or whatnot. For B, provide a list of covered employees placed in safety sensitive positions, as well as supervisors charged with making reasonable suspicion determinations during the review period. Similarly, then for any training programs that you have that, the covered employees must receive 60 minutes of training on the effects and consequences of prohibited drug use on personal health, that type of thing. Supervisors are supposed to get 120 minutes of training, 60 on indicators of probable drug use and 60 on probable alcohol use. So just make sure that if you that you've got all of your supervisors trained with those, and if you have sign-in sheets or copies of the presentation or anything like that, then provide those. That would be great. Then for D, certificates of service agents, this is referring to your MROs, your medical review officers, your BATs, breath alcohol technicians that are doing your testing. We want to make sure that their certificates are up to date, and so provide those to your reviewers so that they can confirm that. And then also provide a list of subrecipients, contractors, subcontractors, lessees that have safety sensitive employees. Rich, you want to do 5307?
Thank you, Matt. So we're in the final stretches of our presentation here before we open it up for general questions that you've posted in the chat window. So there are about 11 states that also provide direct management of the governor's apportionment for 5307. 39 states have no involvement with 5307. So these questions, A through A through F, will only primarily relate to those state DOTs that directly manage the 5307. The elements here are pretty self-explanatory. Agreements with the MPOs relative to public transportation, permitting the small urban areas to piggyback on the public participation plan of the MPO, and documentation that there's an agreement in place to do that. Processes for public comment on the program of projects, and other elements such as half fare, ensuring that recipients offer half fare discounts during off-peak hours and the like. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on 5307 in order to devote time to 5310 and 5311. So if we could have the next slide. Again, let me refer to the RER tips in this area. When you're uploading documents, we're public transportation professionals. We're not IT professionals, so try to avoid proprietary formats of the documents. Make them Word, Excel, Adobe Acrobat PDF documents. If you have unique software that generates its own format, it may not be possible for your contractor to open the document, and that could provide delays in reviews of those documents that you'll want to avoid. Also, sometimes when you scan the PDF, it may lock the document and prohibit the reviewer from conducting word searches when you have not identified the specific page that we're looking for a particular policy or statement. We often use a search process to find that within these larger policy manuals. You want to make sure that we've got that option available to us, and that may be locked if you have protected that document in some form or fashion. Most of the reviewers on all the contracting firms will go through every page, every document you upload, and we will extensively highlight those documents. Sometimes protected documents will not permit our highlight. Try to avoid that if at all possible as a document tip. In the 5310 program requirements that are of interest to you, our requests are not all that complicated. But generally it is related to instances when you award 5310 funds, not to a nonprofit organization, but to a public body that has been approved by you to coordinate services for elderly and disabled individuals. And certification that no readily available nonprofit organization exists within that service area of the project to coordinate the delivery of specialized services for seniors and persons with disabilities, an element that you'll find in Chapter 3 of 5310 Circular 9070. Also, if you have any situations where 5310 vehicles are leased, that template should be uploaded. And our next slide, Matt. For 5311, the main focus here is on intercity bus 5311F compliance. If in fact you're not expending 15% of your apportionment for intercity bus projects, you know that you have to have the governor's certification that intercity bus needs have been met in the state. You'll want to provide that documentation, and you also should provide any copies of any intercity bus studies that you've conducted since the last review to verify that needs have been met, or that would indicate that or trigger the need for the governor's certification. The next slide, please. With respect to your PTASP, your Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan, this is one of the newer requirements, as Matt has pointed out. Obviously, we want to upload the agency safety plans, documentation that you have the board of directors or equivalent authority approval of the plan. It's been embraced by the agency. It's been approved by the state oversight agency, and some organization chart that provides some direct lineage or uninterrupted line of communication between the accountable executive and the CEO of the organization. Your emergency preparedness response plan, if it wasn't included, and that was a rail only requirement, very unlikely that will apply to most of you participating in this webinar. A list of small public transportation providers and opt-out letters as appropriate. And then in cybersecurity, this will only apply to those entities that operate rail services, and there is no RER documentation required in Section 23, but I would refer you to the contractor's manual if you'd like to learn more about that. And then finally, before we close, I'd like to ask one final poll question here. Did you find this webinar useful? You have one, definitely yes. So the highest remark should be a 1. If you did not find this webinar useful, that would be a 5 or somewhere in between. You'll see your choices. And if you could vote on that, I'm now going to turn it over to our associate, Greg Harnett, to moderate the questions that you've posed in the chat window. And our team will try to answer or refer you to the appropriate source as necessary.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rich. So we had a few questions that I believe were addressed during the presentation, so I'll hang on to those and get to the fresh ones first. So first up, we have a question about item 5E in the RIR. So that's under the Technical Capacity Project Management section. So the RIR asks for a list of subrecipient projects with significant delays and or cost increases. Our question is, does this include vehicles?
Yes, it's not just construction projects or anything like that. So it would be vehicles. And, you know, obviously, I don't think the percentage there is a firm percentage. I think it's just to clue in the reviewer that there may have been delays or cost overruns on a particular project. So it's not a hard cutoff, but it's just something that your reviewer will want to take a look at.
And the question is aimed at trying to identify weaknesses in contract oversight procedures. As we're all aware, there are supply chain issues with vehicle acquisitions that will be outside the scope of responsibility of the state DOT. Your reviewer will not hold the state DOT responsible for the fact that Ford Motor Company it's now taking 15 months to deliver a vehicle that used to take 6 months. So don't be alarmed. I sense that was the real heart of the question. Will we be held accountable to such delays? That would not be indicative of a contract management oversight weakness.
And also the reviewer and FTA, they're both going to be aware that there's an ongoing pandemic that might have impacted things as well.
Great. So next up, we have a question. We have a state DOT that has about 65 5311 subrecipients. So in the context of drug and alcohol testing, specifically reasonable suspicion, they're asking, is the RIR requiring a list of all such employees from all of these agencies? So meaning anyone tasked with making that reasonable suspicion determination?
Yeah, that would be correct.
Great, thank you, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
We have a new question that just came in. So we're talking about Section 2, Item R of the RIR. And the question is, are states to provide a list of subrecipients with an approved indirect cost rate that's different from the 10% de minimis rate? Or is the RIR asking for a list of all subrecipients that use any form of indirect costs?
Right. As you're aware, the uniform guidance created essentially an easy path to claim indirect costs under a federal award. And the way that I would handle a response to that question is I would list all of my subrecipients who claim indirect costs, and then in a separate column, I would indicate whether or not they do so under an indirect cost allocation plan or ICAP, or I would put the word de minimis, meaning that subrecipient claimed the automatic 10% rate.
Thank you, Rich. Great. And then another question that I believe you both hit on, but I just want to give you the opportunity to put a bow on it. So we had some recipients who had been through the review process before, and they noted when the state management review was in person, of course, there were visits to various subrecipients. So we have a number of people wondering how that's going to work within the context of our virtual review process. And I believe we talked about it, but just wanted to give you an opportunity to put a bow on it, so to speak.
Yeah, so with the virtual process, it's going to be basically meetings like this that the reviewer is going to have with various staff at your agency. And in addition to that, then they're going to be talking to potentially they'll select several subrecipients for each program, probably 1 to 2, and they'll communicate that to you, and you'll have to basically set up meetings between probably you, the subrecipient, and your reviewer so that everything can get hashed out. Do you have anything to add, Rich?
Yeah, because this is a relatively new process, we've only got 1 year's worth of experience under our belt. And based on the experience of the prior year, the reviewers selected 15311, 15310, and 15339 subrecipient. And they, if you look at the contractor's manual, generally the last question of each of the 23 sections, if it is applicable, will ask about subrecipient oversight procedures. And the reviewer is using that remote session with your subrecipients to basically assess, are you in fact conducting the requisite oversight activities that you've told us about in your RER documentation, in your SMP, and other uploaded documents about how you conduct oversight. It's basically a confirmation step that you do or do not do the steps you've told FTA in other documentation.
Great, thank you. So another question, we had someone ask that, well, they just noted that they are a state that does not actually operate any transit service. So with respect to Section A of the RIR, the recipient profile, Table 1 is all about operations. So they're wondering if they are correct in assuming that they can skip Table 1, but Table 2 would be the one that they fill out.
That's absolutely correct. It would be important just maybe to put an NA in one of the boxes and note that Oregon DOT does not operate transit services, period. And that's all they would have to do in the first box, and they can move right on to the table that is designed specifically for state DOTs.
Wonderful. And those are all the outstanding questions we have. Obviously, we still have a little bit of time left. So I just want to encourage anyone, if you were waiting till the end to ask your question, this would be that time. So please type it in the Q&A box, or you could use the chat, and we'll have Matt or Rich entertain that question for you.
And one thing to note, of course, Greg, is, this isn't your only opportunity to ask questions. You can ask questions to us and we'll do our best to answer them. Some questions specific to your agency are probably best suited to be asked directly to your reviewer. And again, while this webinar series is, how to respond to the RIR, your reviewer is going to be doing a much deeper dive in either late January or early February. They're actually going to go through the entire contractor's manual, go through all the sections, go through all the requirements. And so that's an opportunity for you to, first of all, get to know your reviewer, but also to ask questions to them as well.
And then I just want to add a highlight to the comment, and I know it may not be applicable to most of you on this particular session, but in my haste, I indicated that the line of communication between the accountable executive should be with the Chief Safety Officer. So Eric, thank you for that comment in the chat window, not the CEO. That's for rail transit agencies only.
Great, we have a new question. So this asks, with respect to COVID-19, many of our documents are uploaded. We are in the process, then there was a shutdown. However, if for some reason the documents have not been scanned due to COVID, how should that be handled?
That's a good question. Ultimately, your reviewer is going to want to see those documents. So if you're able to go into the office and get those scanned, then because the materials that you're going to be submitting as part of your RER response, it's just basically the starting point of all the information exchange that's going to happen. There are going to be follow-up items that the reviewer is going to ask for. They're going to be selecting maintenance records and procurements that they want to take a look at. So there will be definitely more information that's being requested. And so being able to scan that in or otherwise get it digitized and provide to your reviewer is definitely of paramount importance.
If you're in an environment where the office has been shut down and you're not permitted to enter the office because of the Omicron outbreaks or what have you that may be impactful in your area, I would definitely immediately contact, if possible, FTA as well as the contractor and advise them of your situation and ask for their guidance on how you should proceed.
Great, and that's all the questions we have at this point. So we can give it another minute or so, and then I'll turn it back to you, Matt and Rich, to take us home.
All right, great.
Great, and the only new question I see is from Sharon. She previously asked if there would be a recording of this webinar available. The answer is yes, and in the chat I provided the link to the page on FTA's website where I expect this to be posted. You can already see a recording from a prior session that we did. So that's where it'll be located. In terms of when will this recording be posted, I'd say within the next several days. And just to keep you guys updated, I do not see any new questions at this point.
In that case, Greg, on behalf of the FTA and RLS and Associates, we want to thank all of you who were participants in this workshop. We appreciate your attention. Good luck to you on your uploads. We wish you the best of luck and do well in your reviews. Matt, take us home.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. This was very well attended, and so are other sessions. Again, we've got some more sessions next week, so check FTA's website if you're interested in attending, or if you had a colleague that missed out on this one or whatnot. But definitely thank you for taking the time, your participation, and like Rich said, we wish you all the luck. So, take care, everyone.
Stay safe, everyone.